Zixathara stood before the massive viewing screen in the Galactic Observation Council chamber, watching the holographic display of a small blue planet spinning slowly in the darkness of space. The planet looked unremarkable, no different from thousands of other worlds the Velthari had catalogued over the centuries. Yet this one had caught the Council's attention for reasons that seemed almost trivial to the experienced xenobiologist. The beings inhabiting this world called themselves humans, and they were about to engage in what their primitive military forces termed a war. The enemy they faced was the Kethvar Empire, a species the Council knew well from previous observations. The Kethvar possessed advanced plasma weaponry, energy shields that could deflect most known projectiles, and numerical superiority that made the outcome of any conflict predictable within acceptable mathematical parameters. Elder Quindar, the Council's primary strategist, gestured toward the display with one of his 4 elongated appendages. His voice carried the cold precision that all Velthari had perfected over millennia of logical evolution. The humans show promise as potential auxiliary forces for future galactic conflicts. Their population is substantial, their breeding rate acceptable, and their apparent willingness to engage in combat despite technological disadvantages suggests a useful lack of survival instinct. Zixathara nodded, making mental notes in the data storage implant behind their left optical sensor. The assignment seemed routine enough, though the timing was somewhat unusual. Most species the Council observed were either too primitive to warrant detailed study or too advanced to require surveillance. These humans seemed to occupy an uncomfortable middle ground that made classification difficult. Your task is straightforward, Elder Quindar continued, manipulating the holographic controls to zoom in on a section of space near the human planet. Observe their military behavior during this conflict. Document their tactical approaches, their response to casualties, and their decision-making processes under extreme stress. The Kethvar blockade of their colony world provides an ideal laboratory for this study. The display shifted to show a cluster of ships surrounding a smaller planet labeled as New Haven in the human database. 50,000 human civilians were trapped on the surface while Kethvar vessels maintained a tight perimeter, preventing any escape or resupply missions. Intelligence reports suggested the humans were planning what their military commanders called a breakthrough operation, though the mathematical probability of success registered as effectively 0. Zixathara studied the tactical situation with professional interest. The Kethvar had positioned their fleet in a classic siege formation, with overlapping fields of fire that would eliminate any approaching vessels long before they could reach the planet's atmosphere. The humans possessed a single capital ship, designated Liberty's Edge in their military records, along with approximately 40 smaller support vessels. Against the Kethvar's 120 ships, including 3 Dreadnought-class vessels, the human force represented little more than an elaborate form of suicide. The cloaking technology will render you completely undetectable to both human and Kethvar sensors, Elder Quindar explained, indicating a small device that would allow Zixathara to observe the conflict from close range. Position yourself aboard the human command vessel. Their captain, a male designated Jake Morrison, appears to be their primary tactical decision-maker. Zixathara accepted the assignment with the calm professionalism that had earned them recognition as one of the Council's most reliable field observers. Over the past 3 centuries, they had documented the military capabilities of dozens of species, from the hive-minded Zephyrians who fought with perfect coordination to the crystalline Nethari who could regenerate from almost any injury. In every case, the outcome of conflicts could be predicted with remarkable accuracy by analyzing technological capabilities, numerical strength, and strategic positioning. The transport to the human fleet took only a few hours using Council technology. Zixathara materialized in what appeared to be a corridor aboard the Liberty's Edge, immediately activating the cloaking field that would keep them invisible to human perception. The ship's interior was surprisingly crude compared to Velthari. Standards with exposed conduits running along the walls and surfaces that showed obvious signs of repair and maintenance. The first humans Zixthara encountered were a group of young males moving through the corridor with urgent purpose. Their uniforms were clean but worn, and their faces displayed a mixture of determination and what the observer recognized as fear. This was expected behavior for a species facing certain destruction, though Zixthara noted that none of them appeared to be in a state of panic or attempting to abandon their posts. Following the corridor toward what sensors indicated was the ship's command center, Zixthara passed through several compartments filled with humans engaged in various activities. Some were cleaning weapons that looked almost primitive compared to Kethvar plasma rifles. Others were running diagnostic checks on equipment that any Velthari engineer would have replaced centuries ago. Most interesting were the small groups, gathered around tables, engaged in what appeared to be recreational activities despite the imminent battle. The command center, which humans called the bridge, was a cramped space filled with control stations and viewing screens. Captain Jake Morrison stood at the center of the room, a male of approximately 40 standard years who carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His uniform was identical to those worn by his subordinates, with only small insignia indicating his rank. Zixthara found this curious, as most species provided their leaders with obvious markers of status and authority. Morrison was studying a tactical display that showed the current positions of both fleets. The mathematics were even more unfavorable than the Council's initial assessment had suggested. The Kethvar had added additional ships to their formation, bringing their numerical advantage to nearly 15-1. Any rational species would have already begun negotiations for surrender or attempted to flee the system entirely. Instead, Morrison turned to address his senior officers with what Zixthara could only describe as confidence. The evacuation shuttles are ready for launch as soon as we break through their perimeter. Lisa, your fighter squadrons will need to hold that corridor open for exactly 18 minutes. Can you do it? Commander Lisa Garcia, a female who appeared to be the ship's primary pilot, nodded without hesitation. We'll make it work, Captain. My people know what's at stake. Zixthara noted this exchange with growing confusion. The humans seemed to be planning not for victory in the traditional sense, but for some form of partial success that would result in the rescue of civilians from the planet below. This suggested they understood their tactical disadvantages, but were proceeding anyway, which violated every principle of logical military doctrine the observer had ever encountered. The preparation phase continued for several more hours, during which Zixthara documented increasingly puzzling behavior. Humans who should have been focusing entirely on their own survival were instead writing messages to be delivered to others in case of their death. Engineers were volunteering for assignments that carried minimal chance of survival. Medical personnel were preparing to treat wounded enemies alongside their own casualties. Most disturbing of all was the complete absence of any attempt to negotiate with the Kethvar or seek alternative solutions. The humans appeared to have accepted that they would likely die in this engagement, yet they continued with their preparations as if this was somehow acceptable. As the Liberty's Edge and its escort vessels began moving toward the Kethvar blockade, Zixthara settled in to observe what they expected would be a brief and predictable engagement. The mathematical certainties were clear, the technological advantages obvious, and the numerical disparities overwhelming. Within a few hours, the observer would be filing a routine report documenting another species' failure to adapt to superior opposition. The first warning alarms began sounding as Kethvar sensors detected the approaching human fleet, and Zixthara prepared to witness the logical conclusion of an impossible mission. The battle began exactly as Zixthara's calculations had predicted, with the Kethvar fleet moving into attack formation and opening fire at maximum range. Plasma beams lanced through space toward the approaching human vessels, each shot carrying enough energy to vaporize a small asteroid. The Liberty's Edge shuddered as its primitive shields absorbed the first impacts, energy readings dropping to dangerous levels within moments of initial contact. Captain Morrison stood calmly at his Command station, watching the tactical display as red markers representing enemy fire converged on his fleet. His voice remained steady as he issued orders to his crew, showing no sign of the panic that Zixathara expected from a species facing certain annihilation. All ships, maintain formation. Lisa, take your squadrons and show them what we can do. Commander. Garcia's voice crackled over the communication system from her fighter craft. Copy that, Captain. All fighters, follow my lead. We're going straight up the middle. Zixthara's analytical mind immediately flagged this as a critical tactical error. The center of the Kethvar formation was their strongest point, protected by overlapping shield generators and concentrated firepower from 3 Dreadnought-class vessels. Any attack on this position would result in immediate destruction of the attacking force, gaining nothing of strategic value while wasting precious resources. The human fighter squadrons streaked toward the enemy formation in tight groups, their small craft dwarfed by the massive Kethvar ships waiting for them. Plasma fire filled the space between the fleets, creating a deadly maze of energy beams that no pilot should have been able to navigate. Yet somehow, Garcia's fighters began weaving between the shots with movements that defied Zixathara's understanding of physics and probability. The first impossible thing happened when pilot Ryan O'Brien's fighter took a direct hit that should have vaporized him instantly. Instead of dying, O'Brien somehow kept his damaged craft operational and continued his attack run toward the nearest Kethvar cruiser. Zixthara watched in amazement as the human deliberately crashed his fighter into the enemy ship's engine core, creating a massive explosion that disabled not only his target but 2 adjacent vessels. This made no logical sense. O'Brien had sacrificed his life and his fighter to achieve a tactical advantage that could have been gained through conventional weapons fire if the humans had possessed adequate technology. Yet his action had somehow accomplished what their primitive missiles could not, creating a gap in the enemy formation that other human fighters immediately exploited. The second impossible thing occurred when the Liberty's Edge came under concentrated fire from 5 Kethvar ships simultaneously. The human vessel's shields collapsed within seconds, leaving it defenseless against weapons that should have reduced it to scattered debris. Instead, Chief Engineer Maya Patel somehow kept the ship's critical systems operational by manually rerouting power through damaged conduits, literally holding broken cables together with her bare hands while directing repair teams throughout the vessel. Zixathara observed Patel working in conditions that should have killed her instantly. Plasma fires burned throughout the engineering section. Toxic gases leaked from ruptured systems, and radiation levels exceeded safe limits for most known species. Yet Patel continued coordinating repairs while personally preventing catastrophic system failures through physical intervention that ignored every principle of self-preservation the observer had ever documented. The third impossible thing began when communications between human ships were severed by Kethvar jamming systems. Military doctrine from every species the Council had studied indicated that loss of coordination would result in immediate tactical collapse, with individual units unable to maintain effective formation or respond to changing battlefield conditions. The human fleet should have disintegrated into chaos within minutes. Instead, Sergeant Alex Rodriguez somehow managed to coordinate ground-based defensive positions using improvised hand signals visible through the viewports of approaching evacuation shuttles. His signals were passed from ship to ship by crew members who interpreted and relayed them with accuracy that suggested telepathic communication. The evacuation proceeded with precision that exceeded what most species achieved with advanced technological coordination systems. As the battle intensified, Zixathara documented increasingly frequent violations of logical military behavior. Corporal Danny Torres, badly wounded and bleeding from multiple injuries, refused medical evacuation and continued, providing covering fire for civilian evacuation shuttles. When questioned by medics, Torres simply stated that others needed help more than he did, as if this explained his willingness to die for beings he had never met. The observer watched Lieutenant Commander Kate Sullivan lead a boarding party onto a damaged HFY vessel, not to capture strategic intelligence or disable weapon systems, but to rescue human prisoners who possessed no tactical value whatsoever. The mission succeeded despite being mathematically suicidal, with Sullivan's team fighting through superior enemy forces to extract personnel who contributed nothing to the overall war effort. Most disturbing was Private Joey Martinez, who abandoned his defensive position to drag his unconscious squad leader through 2 kilometers of hostile territory under active enemy fire. When later asked to explain his actions, Martinez responded with words that Zixathara found incomprehensible. "We don't leave people behind," he said, as if this simple statement justified risking the success of the entire mission for one individual. The pattern repeated throughout the engagement. Humans consistently prioritized individual lives over tactical advantages, chose dangerous rescue missions over safe strategic withdrawals, and somehow achieved positive results through decisions that should have led to catastrophic failure. Every mathematical model Zixathara applied to their behavior predicted disaster, yet the humans continued to accomplish their objectives through methods that defied analysis. Communications Officer Ben Wright maintained contact between scattered human vessels while openly joking about their survival chances, treating certain death as an acceptable outcome if it meant others could escape. Medical Officer Tony Kim treated wounded HFY prisoners with the same care he provided to injured humans, despite the fact that these same enemies had been trying to kill him moments earlier. The most shocking discovery came when Zixathara accessed human communications and realized that every member of their military forces was fully aware of their tactical disadvantages. Captain Morrison had briefed his officers on their 12% probability of mission success, yet morale remained impossibly high throughout the engagement. The humans knew they were likely to die, understood the mathematical certainties working against them, and proceeded anyway as if hope was somehow more powerful than logic. As the first phase of the battle drew to a close, Zixathara found their analytical processes beginning to malfunction. The certainties that had governed their understanding of military conflict for centuries were cracking under the weight of human behavior that consistently achieved impossible results. The species they had expected to document as useful auxiliaries was revealing capabilities that challenged everything the Velthari understood about warfare. The evacuation of New Haven's civilian population was proceeding ahead of schedule, despite overwhelming enemy opposition. Human casualties were severe, but somehow acceptable to the survivors who continued fighting with determination that increased rather than decreased as their situation worsened. The Liberty's Edge remained operational despite damage that should have destroyed it, held together by engineering solutions that violated known principles of physics and crew members who refused to acknowledge the possibility of failure. For the first time in 3 centuries of field observation, Zixathara experienced something their species had never developed adequate concepts to describe. The cold logic that had always provided clear answers to every question was failing to explain what they were witnessing, and the emotional disturbance this created was unlike anything in their previous experience. The humans were winning a battle. They should have lost, through methods that made no sense, for reasons that transcended rational analysis. Zixathara began to suspect that this assignment would not result in the routine report they had expected to file. The second day of battle brought events that pushed Zixathara's understanding beyond the breaking point. What had begun as isolated incidents of impossible human behavior had evolved into a consistent pattern that challenged every fundamental principle the observer had learned about warfare, survival, and logical decision-making. The morning shift began with news that should have ended human resistance immediately. Long-range sensors detected 3 additional HFY battle groups approaching the system, effectively tripling the enemy's numerical advantage. Any rational species would have immediately begun surrender negotiations or attempted to flee while escape remained mathematically possible. Instead, Captain Morrison called his senior staff together for what he termed a planning session. Zixathera positioned themselves in the corner of the briefing room, watching as Morrison spread tactical displays across the table. The mathematics were now so unfavorable that the observer's analytical systems refused to calculate probability percentages, simply displaying error messages when asked to process scenarios with such overwhelming disadvantages. The additional Kathavar forces will arrive in 36 hours, Morrison announced calmly. That gives us a window to complete the evacuation and maybe accomplish something else while we're here. He gestured toward a section of the tactical display showing the enemy command ship. Intelligence suggests they're holding about 200 human prisoners aboard their flagship. I want them back. Commander Garcia studied the display with the same calm professionalism she had shown throughout the engagement. That's a heavily shielded dreadnought with escort vessels. We'd have to punch through their entire formation to reach it. Lieutenant Commander Kate Sullivan leaned forward, examining the enemy positions. It's doable. We'd need to coordinate with the evacuation to create maximum confusion. Hit them when they're focused on the civilian shuttles. Zixathera's analytical processes struggled to understand this conversation. The humans were discussing a rescue mission for prisoners who possessed no strategic value, would consume resources, desperately needed for their own survival, and could only be reached by attacking the strongest point in the enemy formation. The mission violated every principle of military logic the observer had ever documented. Yet within hours, Sullivan was leading a strike force toward the Kethvar flagship, while evacuation shuttles continued their runs to the planet's surface. The coordination required for this dual operation should have been impossible for a species with their primitive technology, but somehow human personnel managed to execute both missions simultaneously without interference. The rescue mission itself defied everything Zixathera understood about tactical possibilities. Sullivan's strike force approached the enemy flagship through a debris field created by earlier fighting, using destroyed ships as cover while maintaining radio silence that should have made coordination impossible. When Kethvar fighters moved to intercept them, human pilots engaged in combat maneuvers that appeared to violate basic physics. Pilot Marcus Webb flew his damaged fighter in patterns that sensors indicated should have torn his craft apart, yet somehow maintained structural integrity while eliminating 3 enemy interceptors. When his weapons systems failed, Webb used his fighter's engine exhaust as a weapon, positioning himself to disable enemy ships through precisely controlled plasma burns that required mathematical calculations beyond human mental capabilities. The boarding action that followed challenged Zixathera's understanding of combat psychology. Sullivan's team fought through the enemy ship's corridors against superior numbers, advanced weaponry, and defensive positions that should have been impregnable. Yet they advanced steadily toward the prisoner-holding areas, sustaining casualties but never retreating or acknowledging the possibility of failure. Most disturbing was the behavior of Sergeant Nina Foster, who had been severely wounded during the initial boarding but continued fighting despite injuries that should have rendered her unconscious. Foster maintained her position in the team formation while bleeding from multiple wounds, providing covering fire that allowed her squad mates to advance toward their objective. When Private Joey Martinez attempted to treat Foster's injuries, she refused medical attention and ordered him to continue the mission. "The prisoners need us more than I need bandages," she stated, as if this explanation justified her willingness to die for people she had never met and might never see again. The rescue succeeded, but at a cost that made Zixathera question their understanding of human psychology. Sullivan's team extracted all 200 prisoners but lost half their own personnel in the process. The mathematical exchange was clearly unfavorable, trading experienced military personnel for civilians and captured non-combatants who contributed nothing to combat effectiveness. Yet the rescued prisoners immediately volunteered to join human combat units, refusing evacuation to the surface in favor of participating in ongoing operations. Their stated reason was gratitude for their rescue, but Zixathera observed that their integration into human military formations increased overall effectiveness despite their lack of recent combat experience. The pattern repeated throughout the day with increasing frequency. Communications Officer Ben Wright maintained contact with scattered human vessels while simultaneously coordinating civilian evacuations, treating both tasks as equally important despite the obvious tactical priority that should have been given to military communications. Medical Officer Tony Kim established treatment centers that served human and Kethvar wounded without distinction, despite the strategic advantage that could have been gained by allowing enemy casualties to die. Most incomprehensible was the behavior of Chief Warrant Officer Sam Parker, who volunteered for a reconnaissance mission that intelligence reports indicated had no chance of survival. Parker's task was to infiltrate a Kethvar facility on New Haven's surface and gather information about enemy defensive positions for the ongoing evacuation. The mission required Parker to operate alone behind enemy lines for an extended period, with no possibility of rescue if he was captured or wounded. Success would provide tactical intelligence that might save civilian lives during evacuation, but failure was almost certain and would result in the loss of one of the Liberty's Edge's most experienced personnel. Parker accepted the assignment without hesitation, expressing only concern that his absence might burden other crew members with additional responsibilities. His final transmission before departing for the planet's surface consisted of a message for his family that Zixathara found deeply disturbing in its implications about human emotional attachments. "Tell them I kept my promise to come home," Parker said. "I'll just be taking the long way." The observer struggled to process this statement, which seemed to suggest that Parker considered death an acceptable alternative to abandoning his responsibilities to both his military unit and the civilians they were trying to protect. This implied a psychological framework that prioritized abstract concepts like duty and loyalty over concrete realities like survival and self-preservation. As the day progressed, Zixathara documented similar behavior from dozens of human personnel. Engineer Maya Patel continued maintaining critical ship systems despite radiation exposure that should have been fatal hours earlier. Pilot Ryan Chen flew evacuation missions through hostile airspace while his fighter disintegrated around him, somehow keeping his craft operational through willpower that transcended mechanical limitations. The civilian evacuation proceeded with efficiency that exceeded anything Zixathara had observed from technologically advanced species. Human military personnel coordinated with civilian leaders to prioritize vulnerable populations, ensure adequate supplies for the journey to safety, and maintain morale among evacuees who were abandoning their homes with little hope of return. Most remarkable was the complete absence of panic or despair among either military or civilian personnel. Despite overwhelming odds, catastrophic casualties, and the virtual certainty of death for those remaining behind to ensure the evacuation's success, human morale remained impossibly high throughout the operation. The observer began experiencing psychological symptoms that had no equivalent in Velthari medical literature. The logical certainties that had always provided clear frameworks for understanding complex situations were dissolving under the weight of human behavior that achieved positive results through methods that made no rational sense. By the end of the second day, Zixathara had documented over 300 separate incidents of humans achieving impossible outcomes through decisions that violated every principle of logical military doctrine. The species they had expected to classify as useful auxiliaries was demonstrating capabilities that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying Galactic Council strategic planning. The evacuation of New Haven was now ahead of schedule, despite increasing enemy resistance. Human casualties remained severe, but somehow acceptable to survivors who continued operating with effectiveness that increased rather than decreased as their situation became more desperate. The third day brought the arrival of the additional Kethvar battle groups, along with something that sent Zixathara into complete psychological shock. Long-range sensors detected a massive energy signature building within the enemy flagship. Readings that matched Council databases for planet-killer weapons capable of sterilizing entire worlds within minutes of activation. Captain Morrison studied the tactical display with the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout the engagement. But Zixathera's enhanced sensors detected elevated stress indicators in his vital signs. The weapon would require approximately 4 hours to reach full charge, after which New Haven and everyone on its surface would cease to exist. The mathematical solution was obvious to any logical military mind. The humans possessed just enough firepower to damage the weapon while it was charging, but only by concentrating their entire fleet's offensive capabilities on a single target. Success would prevent the destruction of New Haven, but would leave human forces defenseless against the remaining HFY vessels. The tactical exchange was clearly favorable, trading military assets for a planetary population of 50,000 civilians. Instead, Morrison called another planning session that defied every principle of strategic thinking Zixathera had ever encountered. "The evacuation shuttles can extract another 30,000 people in the next 4 hours, he announced. That leaves 20,000 still on the surface when the weapon fires. Commander Garcia examined the tactical projections with obvious frustration. "If we hit the weapon now, we can stop it from firing. But we won't have enough firepower left to hold off their fleet while the evacuation continues." Lieutenant Commander Sullivan nodded grimly. "It's a choice between saving everyone by destroying the weapon or saving most people by protecting the evacuation. We can't do both." Morrison was silent for several minutes, studying displays that showed evacuation progress, weapon charging, status, and fleet positions. When he finally spoke, his words sent Zixathera's analytical systems into complete failure. "We continue the evacuation. Every person we can get off that planet lives. That's what matters." The observer's logical processes simply could not parse this decision. Morrison was choosing to sacrifice a strategic advantage that would save 50,000 lives in favor of a humanitarian operation that would save 30,000 at best. The mathematics were clear, the strategic implications obvious, yet the human commander was deliberately selecting the inferior option for reasons that made no rational sense. Colonel Amy Chen, the ground forces commander coordinating planetside, evacuation voiced the objection that Zixathera's own analytical systems were generating. "Sir, if we don't stop that weapon, everyone remaining on the surface dies, including my people who are running the evacuation." Morrison's response revealed something about human psychology that sent the observer into a state approaching panic. "I know, Amy, but we don't sacrifice the people we can save for the people we might save. Every life that gets off that planet is a victory." The evacuation continued with desperate efficiency, while the HFY weapon continued charging toward lethal capacity. Human military personnel threw themselves into the operation with intensity that exceeded anything Zixathera had previously documented, knowing that their own survival depended on completing an impossible task within an inadequate time frame. Admiral Pete Jackson's fleet held defensive positions around the evacuation routes, while HFY forces pressed their attacks with increasing aggression. Jackson himself led a fighter squadron in actions that should have been suicidal, somehow maintaining tactical effectiveness despite damage that rendered most of his craft's systems inoperative. The ground evacuation revealed human behavior that pushed Zixathera's understanding beyond any rational framework. Medic Tony Kim established aid stations that treated wounded from both sides equally, providing medical care to HFY soldiers who had been trying to kill him hours earlier. When questioned about this apparent tactical error, Kim responded, with words that the observer found incomprehensible. "They're hurt," he stated simply. That's enough. This response implied a moral framework that prioritized individual suffering over collective strategic advantage, treating enemy casualties as deserving of care despite their threat to mission success. Zixathera's species had no equivalent concepts for this type of thinking, which seemed to ignore every principle of logical resource allocation. The pattern repeated throughout the evacuation operation. Chief Warrant Officer Sam Parker, who had somehow survived his reconnaissance mission, volunteered for another assignment that carried minimal survival probability. His task was to manually disable the planet-killer weapon from within the Kethvar flagship, a mission that required infiltrating the most heavily defended vessel in the enemy fleet. Parker accepted this assignment, knowing it was effectively a death sentence, expressing only concern that his sacrifice might not be sufficient to save the remaining evacuees. His final message to Captain Morrison contained words that revealed the depth of human psychological attachment to abstract concepts over personal survival. "Tell my wife I kept my promise to come home," Parker transmitted as his small craft approached the enemy flagship. "I'll just be taking the long way around." The observer watched in horrified fascination as Parker fought his way through the Kethvar vessel's corridors, somehow reaching the weapons control center despite resistance from security forces that should have overwhelmed him within minutes. The manual shutdown procedure required Parker to remain at the controls while the weapon's stored energy discharged through the ship's hull, creating radiation levels that would be lethal within seconds. Parker completed his mission, transmitting final confirmation just as the weapon's energy readings dropped to safe levels. His last words were directed not to his military commanders but to family members he would never see again, expressing emotional attachments that Zixthara's species had evolved beyond centuries earlier. The weapon's destruction created chaos throughout the Kethvar fleet, but also eliminated the humans' tactical advantage for the remaining evacuation time. Enemy forces pressed their attacks with renewed intensity, forcing human defenders into impossible positions that should have resulted in immediate collapse of the entire operation. Instead, the evacuation accelerated beyond all mathematical possibilities. Pilot Marcus Webb flew shuttles through hostile airspace while his craft disintegrated around him, somehow maintaining flight capability through willpower that transcended mechanical limitations. Engineer Maya Patel kept evacuation vessels operational despite system failures that should have been catastrophic, literally holding damaged components together while coordinating repairs throughout multiple ships. Sergeant Nina Foster, who should have died from her injuries days earlier, led ground forces in actions that held evacuation sites against overwhelming enemy attacks. Her tactical decisions violated every principle of defensive warfare the observer had ever studied, yet somehow achieved positive results that allowed civilian evacuation to continue. The most disturbing incident occurred when Private Joey Martinez discovered a group of wounded Kethvar soldiers in an abandoned evacuation site. Rather than eliminating potential threats or ignoring enemy casualties, Martinez spent precious time providing medical aid to beings who had been trying to kill human civilians hours earlier. When questioned about this decision, Martinez responded with words that revealed the true horror of human psychology. "They're somebody's family too," he said, as if this justified endangering the mission for the sake of enemy personnel who contributed nothing to human survival. As the final evacuation shuttles lifted off from New Haven's surface, Zixthara attempted to calculate casualty statistics and mission success rates. The numbers made no logical sense. Human military forces had sustained 70% casualties while achieving tactical objectives that mathematics indicated were impossible. They had rescued not only their own civilians, but substantial numbers of enemy wounded, treating both groups with equal priority, despite obvious resource limitations. Most incomprehensible was the complete absence of regret or despair among surviving human personnel. Despite catastrophic losses, strategic disadvantages, and the near certainty of death in the final battle phase, human morale remained impossibly high throughout the operation. The evacuation succeeded in saving 47,000 people from certain death, exceeding all mathematical projections despite the tactical decisions that should have resulted in complete failure. Yet as Zixthara reviewed their observations, the observer realized that the humans considered this a partial victory at best, expressing regret for the 3,000 people they had been unable to save. This psychological framework, which treated partial success as failure while maintaining operational effectiveness despite overwhelming odds, represented something beyond the observer's capability to analyze or understand. The humans had achieved the impossible through methods that violated every principle of logical military doctrine, motivated by concepts that transcended rational self-interest. Zix Thara stood once again before the Galactic Observation Council chamber, but everything had changed. The familiar viewing screens and holographic displays seemed somehow smaller now, less significant than they had appeared before the assignment began. The observer's analytical systems, which had functioned with perfect precision for 3 centuries, now struggled to process information that refused to fit into logical categories. Elder Quindar gestured for the presentation to begin, his 4 appendages moving with the same cold efficiency that had always characterized Velthari leadership. Present your findings regarding human military capabilities. The Council requires classification parameters for potential integration into galactic conflict scenarios. The report Zixathara had prepared was unlike anything they had ever submitted to the Council. Standard military assessment protocols called for technical analysis of weapon systems, tactical doctrine evaluation, and statistical projections of combat effectiveness under various scenarios. Instead, the observer found themselves attempting to describe psychological phenomena that had no equivalent in Velthari experience. The humans do not fight wars, Zixthara began, watching as confusion rippled through the assembled council members. They fight for concepts that transcend tactical advantage or strategic necessity. During the New Haven engagement, human forces consistently prioritized objectives that made no mathematical sense, yet achieved results that exceeded all logical projections. Elder Quindar's optical sensors flickered with irritation. Clarify your statement. All species fight wars when territorial or resource conflicts arise. Describe their weapons technology and tactical formations. Zixthara accessed their data, files, displaying holographic recordings of the battle. Human weapons technology is approximately 3 centuries behind Kethvar standards. Their numerical disadvantage exceeded 15-1. Mathematical models predicted complete defeat within the first engagement period. Instead, they achieved tactical victory through methods that violate known principles of military science. The recordings showed human fighters attacking the strongest points of enemy formations, military personnel sacrificing themselves for civilians with no genetic relationship, and commanders choosing humanitarian objectives over strategic advantages. The council members watched in growing bewilderment as the documentation revealed behavior that made no sense within any logical framework. Observe Sergeant Maria Lopez, Zixthara continued, highlighting a recording from the battle's final phase. Injured and trapped behind enemy lines, she spent her remaining time teaching captured Kethvar soldiers human songs rather than attempting escape or revealing strategic information. Her actions provided no tactical benefit, yet somehow influenced enemy behavior in ways that assisted the evacuation operation. The recording showed Lopez, bleeding from multiple wounds, sitting in a damaged shelter with 3 young Kethvar, soldiers who had been separated from their unit. Instead of treating them as prisoners or threats, she was teaching them a simple melody about home and family. The enemy soldiers, who should have been attempting to escape or signal for rescue, were listening with what could only be described as fascination. When Kethvar reinforcements arrived at this position, they found their own personnel defending the human soldier who had been caring for them, Zixthara explained. This created confusion in enemy ranks that delayed their advance by several hours, allowing additional civilian evacuations to succeed. Elder Quindar studied the data with obvious frustration. This represents an anomaly in enemy behavior, not a reliable tactical doctrine. What are their standard military formations and engagement protocols? The observer accessed additional recordings, showing Lieutenant Paul Davis sharing his rations with wounded Kethvar prisoners while his own forces faced supply shortages. Human military doctrine appears to prioritize individual welfare over collective strategic advantage. They consistently allocate resources to enemy casualties despite tactical disadvantages this creates. More recordings followed, documenting behavior that pushed the Council's understanding beyond rational limits. Medical personnel treating enemy wounded with the same priority as their own casualties. Engineers sharing technical knowledge with captured HFY specialists. Combat troops risking their lives to evacuate enemy civilians from combat zones. These actions violate every principle of logical resource allocation, Zixthara continued. Yet they somehow produce tactical advantages that exceed what humans could achieve through conventional military methods. Enemy forces repeatedly showed reduced combat effectiveness when confronted with human personnel who treated them as individuals rather than obstacles. The most disturbing documentation came from the evacuation's final phase, when surviving human forces had been given the opportunity to escape while HFY attention was focused on their damaged flagship. Instead of accepting this chance for survival, human commanders chose to continue rescue operations for both human and enemy casualties trapped in combat zones. Observe Captain Morrison's final tactical decision, Zixthara said, displaying communication logs from the Liberty's Edge. With escape routes open and mission objectives achieved, he chose to remain in the combat zone to search for survivors. This decision carried no strategic benefit and substantial risk of capture or death. The recording showed Morrison coordinating search and rescue operations while HFY reinforcements closed in on their position. His stated objective was to ensure that no one, human or enemy, was abandoned on the battlefield. The mathematical probabilities were clear. This decision would likely result in the loss of experienced personnel who could contribute to future operations. Instead, the search and rescue mission located over 300 survivors, including significant numbers of HFY personnel who had been presumed dead by their own forces. When these rescued enemies were returned to HFY command, their reports of human behavior created psychological effects that influenced subsequent enemy tactical decisions. The rescued HFY soldiers reported treatment that contradicted their understanding of human nature, Zixthara explained. This created doubt within enemy command structure regarding their assessment of human capabilities and motivations. Subsequent engagements showed measurably reduced HFY combat effectiveness. Elder Quindar attempted to process this information within existing strategic frameworks. Are you suggesting that humans employ psychological warfare techniques designed to confuse enemy decision-making processes? The observer paused, struggling to find words for concepts that had no equivalent in Velthari language. No. The humans appear to genuinely believe that individual life has value regardless of species, political affiliation, or strategic significance. This is not a tactical deception, but a fundamental aspect of their psychology. The final recordings showed the aftermath of the New Haven evacuation, with human survivors establishing memorial sites that honored both their own casualties and enemy personnel who had died in the conflict. The inscriptions made no distinction between human and HFY names, treating all deaths as equally tragic regardless of which side they had fought on. They built monuments to their enemies, Zixthara said, highlighting images of the memorial construction. The primary inscription reads, "They gave everything so that others might choose to give freely." This suggests that humans view warfare not as a competition for resources or territory, but as a test of moral principles. The council members exchanged glances that conveyed confusion and growing concern. The documentation they were reviewing suggested a species whose military capabilities could not be measured using conventional analysis methods. Human effectiveness appeared to derive from psychological factors that had no equivalent in known strategic doctrine. What classification do you recommend for integration into galactic conflict scenarios? Elder Quindar asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer would be problematic. Zixthara accessed their final analysis, data that had taken weeks to compile and had challenged every assumption they had developed about intelligent species over 3 centuries of observation. I recommend that humans be classified as unsuitable for auxiliary service in any galactic conflict scenario. The statement created immediate controversy within the council chamber. Elder Vextar, the military strategic coordinator, objected with characteristic Velthari directness. Their combat effectiveness exceeded mathematical projections. They achieved victory against superior opposition. This indicates valuable military potential. The observer's response contained implications that sent disturbing ripples through the assembled council members. Humans do not fight for victory in the traditional sense. They fight for principles that transcend strategic objectives. This makes them unpredictable allies and dangerous enemies, not because of their weapons or tactics, but because they measure success using criteria that ignore mathematical realities.